this headline is about the county trying to buy sort of outstanding medical debt for pennies at the dollar, and then just to forgive that debt. So we note in the book that this context then of sort of recurrent crises and economic instability and now longer experience with available forms of credit seems to have sparked new efforts to organize around issues of debt and overcome some of those earlier barriers to debtor mobilization that I presented that were sort of portrayed as being inherent to indebtedness, inherent to the difficulty of mobilizing, but that we argue weren't present in the 19th century. They seem to be coming back now, though. So what are some implications and conclusions? I want to argue a few things. One is that it's important to take a long-term view of debt relief. First, how debts are dealt with. In particular, what happens when people have difficulty repaying their debts is a crucial component of credit. There's a growing scholarly discussion among those who study the welfare state and social policy that attempts to make sense of the US's unusual reliance on credit as a substitute for social policy, and even as an economic growth strategy. Monica Prasad, Andreas Wiedemann, Gunnar Trumbull, Sarah Quinn, Alex Reisenbichler, and myself have all looked at different ways that government credit supports have worked to channel access to higher education, to housing, and also just that sort of access to credit itself is something that households rely on to protect themselves during unexpected economic hardships themselves. So Andreas Wiedemann, for example, finds that people use their credit cards more often in sort of times of unemployment to smooth their consumption. So we know a lot now about how these credit policies came to be, but without also understanding what happens on the other side, what happens when good debts go bad, we can only have a partial understanding of this credit welfare state, of how credit operates as social policy. Second, we should be attentive to the role that debtors themselves have played in the development of state and federal policies here. Debtors actually mobilized for these in many cases in the 19th century and into the 20th as well. And legislatures were to some extent responsive to those demands, even if they were also responsive to the demands of creditors. Throughout the 19th century, we saw this. We saw state and federal efforts at debt relief. And even while those were short-lived, they generally ratcheted up to an expansive system by the end of the 19th century. These organizations in turn are, again, helped to push the limits of what was considered legally possible and even constitutionally acceptable. Finally, as we've seen, the issue of debt relief has come back to the center of political agendas in the United States and electoral politics and congressional politics, more often executive politics, I'll say. And so it's worth thinking again about the relationship of the 19th century to the 20th, because when we consider the role of debtors in the 19th century, it makes that relative absence through the 20th century of debtors into more of a puzzle. Again, some scholars of the 20th century of the lack of bankruptcy politics and debt relief politics have argued that the explanation is straightforward. There are these intrinsic features of credit and debt and access that make it difficult for debtors to mobilize. And while we don't disagree with those difficulties, putting this in a larger, longer historical perspective shows that there are moments in time when those difficulties recede for various reasons. And again, we might be in one of those moments in time. So I'll stop there and take questions, and thank you again. Yep.
You mentioned the demise of usury laws in the late 70s or early 80s.
I did. I just mentioned I can say a little bit more about it. Yeah, so in 1978, the Supreme Court had the Marquette decision, which made it so that states couldn't control the usury laws that they had set in place before. So one of the things that we argue in the book was that this changed the logic from the lender's side, and particularly from credit card companies, of mobilizing at the federal level. Because now that interest rates can sort of be sort of set by a company or don't have to be sort of considered at a state by state level. The payoff to mobilizing for federal bankruptcy law, or sort of in the area of debt relief in general, is very different than it was previously, when one of the most important regulatory levers for credit is happening at the state level. I'm not sure, does that answer your question? Yeah, it's a good question.
First of all, thanks so much. It was super interesting. I can't wait for the book to come out. Hopefully other people can hear me. So I love this history, and I love that you're like your last question here, kind of, are the students the new farmers? I think that's a really important and provocative question. I guess I want to put that back to you, because I can think in some ways how, yes, it's similar, and in many ways it's very different. And I'm sure you've thought about that as well. So maybe, I guess my question is sort of, how are the students not the new farmers, but like the place, like where we're at today is so different from how debt looked like and the generation of debt. So just wondered if you could respond to that.
Thanks. Yeah, it's an intentionally provocative question that elides some key differences between students and farmers. Before I get to the differences, I'll mention just a couple of similarities in the discourse that are sort of related to the discourse that advocacy organizations, particularly the Debt Collective, have used to associate with student debt relief. And so the one that Emily and I think sticks out the most, that's the most striking, is the sort of idea that this has become a necessary investment. And so one of the sort of things that's made debt relief less politically palatable for consumer debtors is the idea, well, this is consumption. It's very different than what farmers are doing. They're involved in productive enterprises, right? And so that's a fundamentally different reason and need that they have than consumers have. And we see this also with that logic was present even during the Great Depression, when Congress had to decide whether to extend the same types of foreclosure relief and mortgage protection that they had extended to farmers to homeowners, which sort of ultimately became programs like the Homeowners Loan Corporation. And so that seems to be a pretty good reason. That was sort of one of the prime discursive reasons for not considering some of these demands. And so what advocates have done in the 20th century say, well, no, actually, college is becoming increasingly seen as a necessary investment. It's something that people are sort of pushed into. It's not really a choice. And as a result, if sort of external circumstances, much like the disasters of the 19th century, make it difficult or impossible for that choice to then pay off, there should be some recourse. Whether or not you think that those are equivalent circumstances is a very different question. It's pretty clear that that is the sort of the effort that's being made, though, is to sort of take economic crises, to take sort of the unemployment rates after 2008, and to use those as a way to sort of say, well, this is a situation that people were sort of forced into and cannot repay for reasons out of their own control. So that's where the similarity kind of exists. That said, you're right. I mean, the sort of way that credit is extended is very different. The role of the federal government is pretty different. One of the reasons I was actually, and as we were writing this book, there was a sort of a nascent student debt movement. We spent a long time fixated on that Occupy Wall Street debt boulder in sort of the early days of working on this project. I think that was, I can't remember what year that was, maybe 2011 or 2012. Is that right? But it didn't seem like something that would catch on for, some of, I think, what you're alluding to here. And so we've been surprised over time that sort of advocates have mobilized around the issue, but sort of also used sort of the idea of productive debt and circumstances out of one's control to try to gain some support for the idea. It's been relatively high in public support. Yeah, I think that.
Hi, thanks for this talk. It was great. I think my question sort of follows up from that, and maybe you kind of began to answer it already, but I was very taken with your point about the importance of the kind of farmers' indebtedness movement relating to the sort of episodic nature of the debt, and that sort of helping to bring awareness to the issue and sort of legitimacy to the issue. So I guess I was wondering if you think that's a sort of necessary or potentially useful kind of condition for kind of contemporary debt.
Oh, it's a
movements.
good question, right? And I think the argument there, or the observation there, would be that it's not just 2008 and it's not just COVID, but it's the sort of the fact that those both happen in sort of, close succession to one another that produces those same sort of opportunities for learning as in the past. I think that's probably right. Or I think that seems like there's a lot of merit behind that idea. We gesture towards it, but it's not the it's still kind of unfolding. But I do think that there is this evidence of sort of learning, and the sort of the fact that people are also individually living through these multiple moments seems to help to generate some momentum for debtor politics today. Thanks.
So I think it's pretty clear that in the last couple of years within the medical and health policy literature, debt has become like a major topic area, but we've obviously done a pretty bad job right now as public health researchers grappling with kind of how political scientists and sociologists have for years been thinking about debt and credit. And I guess, how would you guide us as we're thinking about specifically this trade-off between credit access and debt? I mean, on the one hand, public health people are really interested in thinking about the ways that credit access can act as a social determinant of health, mortgages, student loans, housing, like food insecurity, like people rely on credit. But then there's also this huge concern about debt. And so given that we're still in our infancy in thinking about these questions, like as a political scientist, what can we leverage that's already been what scholarship that's already come about to help us think through this?
It's a great question. And I have to answer as a political scientist and less as a health scholar for the reasons that you point to. I'd love to see more research done on the health, on the side of medical debt and also access to finance and as a determinant of health. There are a few things. There are a few places that scholars of health politics might start. And I think one is to go back to the political science literature, examining sort of the earlier politics of access to credit and this sort of role that organizations have played, but also, and I think this gets to the question of access and the social determinants of health, inequalities in how organizations themselves tend to advocate for members. So political scientists like Dara Strolovich have done a really good job of showing systematically that organizations are, civil rights sort of advocacy, citizens advocacy organizations are much better at prioritizing the concerns of their sort of more advantaged subgroups than their more marginalized ones. And I think that that's something that might help to think about the causes of inequalities in access to credit, and also, again, sort of inequalities in protection against the downside consequences of debt. And I think that there's some room to do more of that kind of work, but looking specifically at health, which I think we don't pay enough attention to, at least political scientists studying credit and debt don't. The other thing I wanted to say was that I think that there are some really interesting specific reasons that it's difficult to mobilize around medical debt that have both to do with, might have to do with the types, the sort of characteristics of people that are most likely to have medical debt. And these might be distinctive from other types of advocacy. I was actually just talking to Keith about this earlier today, that my expectation would have been that medical debt would have been taken up before student loan debt as the thing that gets everyone, really riled up and concerned. Indeed, like Elizabeth Warren started on medical debt. This was one of the things that she was trying to draw attention to earlier in her legal scholarship career, was the role that this played in bankruptcies. Instead, student loan debt, which my sort of prior assumption would have been that this would be more divisive, more likely to be sort of turned into a partisan issue. This would be something that politicians would try to avoid, was the issue that became politically salient and popular and actually was mobilized around. After talking to people who had thought more about the particulars of medical debt, I can start to see maybe some of the possible reasons for why it was more difficult than not to mobilize around it. And so people who are sort of the worst off are probably the least likely to be able to do anything at the time. Another is just who holds the debt. Student loan debt might have become easier to mobilize around as the federal government held most of it, at least most of the debts that Biden was discussing. Medical debt is something that's much more dispersed. It's much more difficult to identify, sort of, there's not like a single actor to appeal to. And so I think that there's just, all of this is to say is that there are a lot of specificities that I think health scholars should look into to try to understand why it's difficult to sort of provide advocacy on this, but also why it's difficult for people to mobilize around this themselves who might be experiencing these problems. Yeah.
I think that's really interesting. And it relates to another question that I had, which is, so when you're thinking about medical debt, debt relief and bankruptcy is one avenue you can go, but obviously, advocates around single payer, right, is like another avenue that you take. Or at the time, the ACA, a lot of the motivation for the ACA was around personal bankruptcies due to medical debt. So I think there was mobilization around medical debt, but how, when it wasn't around, oh, we need debt relief, it was we need healthcare reform and more public coverage, and that's how you get to medical debt relief, right? And so to relate this to, so my question was kind of, I think I wondered, two things. One, there's other avenues besides bankruptcy law, or especially in our current crisis around evictions, foreclosures, student debt with education. These are all areas that are extremely expensive, and we have multiple public policy options. And it seems to me the debt relief options, because Biden is kind of, that's certainly a policy proposal on the table, but from my perspective on the healthcare arena, that's like way late after the fact. We should, it's not the best option, right? So if I had to be on the, trying to mobilize with people, I wouldn't go that direction. So it's just sort of like, how do you think about that from a policy, like studying it, like what policies are relevant here? And also when you think about dispersion, right? So if you say, what's the missing mobilization? Well, I think there was mobilization, but it was around something different. And then another question I have is, what was happening? So you said like all these people at the table, they're elite, either bar lawyers, around bankruptcy. But I think the financial industry is also very much at the table politically. I don't know if it shows up around medical debt, but I would think so. I don't know. So we're like, where is the financial industry in the politics here? Like that seems like a really important part of the story.
Great. Okay. I'll start in the order that you asked. Thank you, and thanks for continuing the line of discussion too. Yeah, so I think there are a few things to say here. One is that we're characterizing bankruptcy as a sort of a safety valve, but it sucks as a safety valve, right? It's not something that anyone takes on lightly, even sort of in its best, at the sort of the height of protectiveness. It is not a great. It's maybe a necessary policy. It is more generous, or it was more generous in the United States than in other comparable sort of industrialized democracies at the time, which tended to not offer a discharge of debts or a fresh start, but would put people into sort of counseling or repayment plans. But it is not a good thing. Having to take on bankruptcy, having to declare bankruptcy is still a sort of, it's a worst case scenario. But again, it's a necessary way to relieve one of debts. I say that because you're right, and it's a good point to make, an important one to make, that because of that, there are other avenues that one might take. And one could argue that the focus on student debt relief is actually missing the sort of cause of student debt in the first place, which beyond sort of economic crises, the cause is that people need to take on more debt to go to school. There's been sort of decline in the public funding of higher education, increase in costs of higher education, and credit is, and sort of a push to encourage people to use debt to pay for it. Similar with health, right? It's sort of the medical bankruptcies are a ruinous consequence of this problem, which is that we don't have sort of rational health system of providing for people. And so I don't think that it's an either or sort of, these aren't either or sort of policy for advocates. However, advocates also do have to make some decisions. Maybe it was a better decision to prioritize the Affordable Care Act, or to prioritize sort of pushing for a single payer rather than to just focus on medical bankruptcy. I think you're probably, I think there's probably something to that. Whether that negates the need for bankruptcy, I think it doesn't, but that is an issue that I think we could, maybe should think about a little bit more. We have a little bit of time to make some, to add to, because they're not absent from the politics of health policy, right? That's right, that's right. And it's important to bankruptcy that they are absent, but that doesn't mean that it's important, that it is, that they're not sort of still affecting, and maybe in sort of more potentially constructive ways, sort of the outcomes of the populations that they're trying to advocate for. So thank you for raising that. And I hadn't really thought about it as much in the health arena as much as we had sort of in higher education, where that sort of, well, these organizations also are pushing for increased funding of higher education, but seem to have not gotten very far in that versus student debt relief. Second question, yeah, so what's happening in the financial industry? I didn't talk that much about the financial industry in this talk, except to answer your question, which was that it was pretty fragmented around some of these issues, in part because of the state regulatory environment for consumer credit and for interest rates. It sort of just didn't really, it wasn't sort of as forceful in pushing for the retrenchment of bankruptcy policies earlier. And they also kind of just, there was also fragmentation within the financial industry itself. So secured debtors and unsecured, or secured creditors and unsecured creditors didn't really see themselves as having the same interest. Secured creditors seemed to see themselves, or sorry, unsecured creditors in the 1970s started to think that the bankruptcy code was tilted more against them, and so started to mobilize more and sort of more forcefully as the industry itself consolidated and as regulation changed. I don't know about how to think about that around medical debt. I think the question is sort of, what are the different financial industry actors and stakeholders involved? It would be a really good set of questions for someone to take up, because again, thinking about both what the state regulatory opportunity structure looks like and whether that shapes how sort of, whether that interest is likely to be sort of unified or fragmented is one question. Then also, again, within the industry itself, to what extent is it sort of coordinated or sort of consolidated, or are there sort of other lines of cleavage that might make financial industry actors in this issue of health or sort of medical debt more likely to want to act in concert or more likely to see themselves as in competition with one another, which would affect how we might see this at the national level or at the state level. It's a really good question. Sorry I don't have a good answer. Like I said, I hope someone would take that question up, though.
We have a couple of online questions. From Professor Harold Pollack, he asks he has commentary beforehand to set up the question. Some barriers are predatory or impulsive credit products, and to excessive borrowing do benefit customers and the wider society, particularly when government becomes the residual creditor for certain kinds of debt, such as home mortgages, and when it's easy for policymakers and the public to confuse expanded credit access with actual subsidies to poor people, which credit is not. Debt relief by itself only deals with part of the problem. What other policy components or regulatory measures are important to include, perhaps by the CFPB and others, to reduce Americans' challenges related to excessive indebtedness and the behavioral economic realities that really do harm people when they have unfettered access to predictable, harmful financial products?
Thank you so much. That reminded me that I also didn't answer part of your question as well, Colleen. So I'm really glad that Harold restated this and sort of laid out the predatory aspect too of many of the sort of barriers or sort of many people's, especially lower income or marginalized groups, access to credit. Okay, so that is right. I'm glad. Again, thank you for the context. And there are other types of policy components. So we mentioned sort of public funding, right? And or sort of more sort of rational systems of public provision in health, in housing, in higher education. Also changes to things like landlord-tenant law are something that we should consider. Perhaps, and sort of just cause eviction is one set of policy prescriptions, sort of usually along with changes to sort of legal representation for renters, and changes with sort of, generally the inclusion of protections for renters who become displaced for reasons that are not sort of related for sort of no fault of their own. For example, if a landlord is planning on renovating a unit to make it sort of either to charge more or to just make it more habitable. If a unit's getting sold, if it's getting turned into condos. So and another sort of set of policy prescriptions would be at the regulatory level, again, sort of involving the sources of some of these challenges. I think this also is where the CFPB comes in as well, thinking about addressing, a source of over-indebtedness is also is taking on a credit product that is itself inherently risky. And so in the 1970s, as I pointed out and mentioned, and in the 60s, advocacy organizations were grappling with this because many of their constituents were facing that as their sort of main alternative was, well, we don't have access to mainstream lending institutions and instead end up having to take on more predatory forms of debt. And so those organizations at the time hung their hope on the idea that pushing for sort of better access, for fair access to mainstream credit markets could at least solve that underlying problem, like that one of these problems, which is that their constituents are forced unfairly to rely on lending relationships that are themselves dangerous. What we see is that it doesn't entirely work out, but whether or not that was a bad strategy is a different question. It was clearly a problem, and sort of it was a concerted strategy to try to deal with the problem of to deal with the credit access problem by making it harder or less likely for their constituents to need to rely on predatory institutions. Today we have things like the CFPB. We could maybe strengthen it or support the CFPB. There are also questions, and it becomes, these questions become really intractable when we think about federalism and we think about sort of which levels of government would be the most effective at addressing some of these root causes of over-indebtedness, again, be they predatory institutions, be they the nature of sort of the contracts that people are entering into, the sort of lack of safety net around things like health, around or lack of investment in higher education. There's the question of sort of what level of government should act, and then what level of government can act. So I live in the city of Evanston. We're discussing changing our landlord-tenant law right now to try to increase the protections for renters. But it's a challenging issue in light of the fact that Evanston is surrounded by other jurisdictions that may or may not opt to do the same thing. And that is a different sort of, so we're looking at a very different calculus of dealing with these root causes than we might be at sort of a state level or at a federal level, where those solutions could be implemented across the board. So, so the sort of the answer in a nutshell to Harold's question is, yeah, we need to think about other ways of dealing with the predatory or roots or other roots, maybe lack of investment or safety net. As a political scientist, that leads to sort of a lot of different types of options, but there are also these questions about feasibility at different levels of government and sort of ability of those to be to be taken up by different forms of governance.
What is the history of debtor's prison in the United States? And did the specter of reaction against it influence the politics perhaps in the 1800s in a way that it wouldn't now?
That's a good question. So we talk a bit about the movement to outlaw or to ban debtors' prisons at the state level in the 19th century. It's a mass movement. Some of this involves things like petitioning. Sometimes it's specifically about imprisonment. Sometimes it's about gender and sort of these concerns about who's actually going to be in these prisons. And it was pretty successful in the sense that we saw most states ban debtors' imprisonment in the 19th century, like a pretty narrow period of time. There's been some discussion in recent years about whether imprisonment for unpaid fines and fees in the criminal justice system, criminal legal debt, or is akin to a modern day debtor's prison. And I think that might speak a bit to your question, right, about the sort of potential for sort of the potential for these types of movements today. Could you repeat the second part of your question?
Given the closeness of debtors' prison
Mm-hmm.
people's mind in the 1800s, when that movement
Yeah.
became active, there's not a parallel situation now.
Okay.
How does that
Well, so
is the absence of
yeah.
that specter make a difference in trying to compare now with
Sure. Yeah. So, I mean, I'll say a few things. So, I mean, one, there is a little bit of a specter, and the issue of sort of how to legally deal with fines and fees, which cannot be discharged in bankruptcy, has come up, and it's been framed as a sort of a modern, it's been framed against this idea that because people can go to jail and serve time for unpaid fines and fees is its own sort of modern day debtor's prison. So it has come up in a really sort of limited way in those circumstances. Whether that affected the 20th century is a different question. And I think you're right to point to the possibility that not having that sort of looming possibility could fundamentally sort of change demand for debt relief. That seems likely. I think that even the existence of a generous bankruptcy code from 1898 that was stable, that's persisted, that wasn't sort of sunset like or repealed like the earlier ones in the 19th century, should itself fundamentally alter how people mobilize around debt relief as well, because there's something that exists. It even allows a cadre of sort of professional, bankruptcy professionals to sort of become active in that area to support it. And so maybe that reduces some of the pressure for debtors themselves to mobilize. You're absolutely right to highlight those differences in context. I think I probably could have said a little bit more about that in the talk too. So I appreciate you bringing that up. But yeah, I think that those are sort of, when we think about these big over time changes and we try to draw some analogies, you're always there. It's also important to recognize how changes over the time limit the sort of analytical ability of some of those analogies to travel. So thank you.
We do have one final question that was posted online from Bonnie Richardson. She asks, when women could finally open lines of credit in their own names in the 1970s, how did that impact bankruptcy laws?
Oh, okay. I wrote a book on that subject. I'm really excited that you asked the question, Bonnie. So I actually don't, or I wrote a book on the first part, on the sort of the changing sort of patterns of access to women's credit in the 1970s. I don't actually know I can't speak to the precise impact of that on bankruptcy laws, except again to highlight that this is a contextual feature of credit that would likely sort of contribute to creditors, lenders' own sense of their interests in pushing for bankruptcy reform, pushing for retrenchment, particularly as this is again happening just a few years short of when we start to see these really fundamental transformations in lending regulation and usury laws and the such. So you have sort of new laws enabling women, particularly married women, sort of prior to the 1970s, it was very difficult to sort of have a credit card. Usually it was in your husband's name. She came across some really fun letters from Ruth Bader Ginsburg to her to Corvette's department store, complaining continually that they would not issue, that they kept issuing the credit card in her husband's name, and she's a professional woman. So that changes. Credit becomes more available to women at the same time that credit scoring takes off. This also becomes a new way of measuring risk. Previously, ascriptive categories like one's sex and marital status, that was more often at that point in the 70s, were used to sort of decide on whether or not to lend to someone, sort of what terms to lend to them, whether to count their whole income or partial income. So we see expansion in access to credit and laws prohibiting discrimination. We see a change in credit scoring, sort of ubiquity of credit scoring, and we see the relaxation of lending constraints all in like really short period of time. So I think it's hard to disentangle one factor. These are all or at least the credit scoring and women's access to credit are kind of related to each other. The relaxation of usury limits is a little bit less related to that. But when we think about those all together, those kind of add up to creditors, again, perhaps feeling like it would be great if they could have a little bit more of a say in the federal law pertaining to bankruptcy. So I hadn't put the Equal Credit Opportunity Act squarely into that setup, but I think it's worth thinking about as well. It certainly is a part of the context that we should think about. Thank you.
I think we're out of time. Thank you very much.